No views. For YouTube. No ad revenue, Jose. Come on. Gotta get them views.
Okay, now me, please. I would like to, Nico, what the heck is that in your ear? Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me?
How dare you, Nico?
You cursed the Church of Jose.
I want to thank everybody who did such a good job on these posters. I noticed that some of you put in like a tremendous amount of effort, and oh my god. And some of you at least took this assignment seriously, and I appreciate that. Now we do have to get some notes down on paper about invasive species, because as a general topic, invasives show up on numerous AP tests. Three separate topics that we're going to discuss. First topic that we're going to discuss is general themes among invasives, characteristics that they have in common. I can think of like 4 or 5 things. Number one, invasives are pretty much always a generalist. Like, if you're pretty good at living in a desert and you get dropped in another desert, you can probably figure that out too. If you're generally living in coastal areas, you can pretty much go to any coastal area. If you're really specialized, it's difficult to specialize in another system. But generalists travel really well. How many of you are confident that your invasive species was a generalist? If you could please look around, that's pretty remarkable that almost every single person raised their hand. That's a really good rule of thumb. Generalists invade well. Now, this is why they survive mass extinctions, because wherever they show up, they'll be fine. Number 2. Invasives have to be breeders. They have to have a high reproductive potential. High reproductive potential.
Jose,
Yeah.
are humans technically an invasive species?
No, this is just our natural range. We weren't moved by other species. We're kind of wherever we spread. So species move around, and that's important. Humans do too.
Are humans generalists?
Humans are pretty generalized, yeah. Yes.
On that note with Nico, when the Europeans came to America, they displaced, I guess, the local ones. Could that be in a way seen as invasive?
I mean, yes, we call that a European invasion of the Americas. Especially if you are native to the Americas, you would feel very invaded, I think. But the terminology of invasive species is predicated on humans moving them. Number 3, I'd like to explain this before you copy it. Invasive species aren't necessarily better than natives, so they can only fill an empty niche. Invasive species capitalize on disturbance. You know, the natives are evolved for Santa Barbara because they're in Santa Barbara and they've been in Santa Barbara. So the natives are pretty good at Santa Barbara. They've had all the natural selection to make them really good at Santa Barbara. If you bring a species from Africa, it's probably good at Africa, but that's not the same thing as Santa Barbara. So an African species probably would not invade an intact system because the natives are already here and they're already good at it. But if you bulldoze the side of the road, then the ice plant can definitely take over. If it just happens to fall there first and there's no natives, it's going to be great. So we say that invasives occupy empty niches. They take advantage of disturbances. Disturbance helps invasives. Did any of you notice an example of this? Are you aware of your species using disturbed habitats? What was yours?
Hardened grass.
And yours? Oh, that's a famous one here in the Channel Islands. And yours?
Argentine ants.
Absolutely, in my kitchen. And yours?
Ice plants.
Yeah, exactly. I on the side of the road. And yours?
Cheatgrass.
Cheatgrass, yes. Is there another one in the back? There's probably others that you don't know are capitalizing on disturbance, but some species are famous for that. Here in Santa Barbara, one of the ones that loves disturbances is mustard. It's like a yellow flower, really, really common on the side of the road. When you drive Highway 101 toward Emma Wood, like right before you hit Ventura, you can look on the left, and there's these like rolling hills of native shrubland. And where the ridge lines were all cut to meet the 101, they're always yellow. Because where we've made the disturbance, you know, our natives are kind of slow growing. That's an adaptation to Santa Barbara. The invasives, they sprout quick because they're generalists. So if you clear the dirt, the invasives can take advantage of that opening. They capitalize on disturbances. Number 4, invasives will often have some sort of a competitive advantage. A way to outcompete natives. It's a new tool in their new landscape. The cane toad's a great example. How many of you have a species which is toxic? Poisonous, venomous? What was yours?
Eucalyptus.
Eucalyptus is toxic, ruins the soil. Does anybody have a nest parasite? A bird that sneaks into the nest of other species? You do? The cowbird? Starling, European starling. Yeah, those are common here. Back wherever starlings are from, species are kind of picky about who they feed. But around here, a starling will lay an egg in like a wren tit nest, and this little tiny bird will hop up on branches to feed a baby that's bigger than itself, because they don't know to look out for nest parasites. Anybody have an extremely aggressive invasive species?
I have a quagga mussels, right?
So those are like high reproductive potential. Those things breed like crazy, and they breed on everything. P.S. That's the world's most expensive invasive. The zebra or quagga mussels, they cost the most money. Yeah.
Argentine ants. Because they can just like, for like each worker they have like a third of a queen. So like they can just move everywhere.
I'd call that a high reproductive potential, but that's interesting. Yes?
As like a water
Hyacinth?
Yeah.
Super high reproductive potential. Yeah?
German yellow jacket.
Those are aggressive. That's true.
I hate those.
They sting and they keep biting as well. They can use their jaws. They're a carnivore, so they will just take chunks out of you, and so they can scare away predators from the nest. Yeah.
The Kazakhstan beetle.
It's from Kazakhstan, so obviously. Okay. Next, the next chunk I want you to put in your notes is how invasives get spread around the map. Remember that we gotta blame humans. If they move on their own, that's not invasion, that's just spreading. So one way is an exotic that we wanted on purpose, but we couldn't contain it. Like an exotic pet or exotic landscape, a zoo or an aquarium, where we're like, oh my God, I want to have this neat thing just in my yard, and before you know it, it's all over town. Exotic pets, exotic landscapes, wood production, ornamentals, exotic food. These are all things that we wanted to keep contained, and we couldn't. Does anybody have something that we wanted on purpose, but then it got away? Yeah?
Burmese python.
Burmese python's a classic. Florida, right? Yep.
Walk-in catfish.
I went to the Everglades and I saw the place where they keep all of the captured ones, and they have trash cans with lids full of Burmese pythons, and there's people that go out every day and catch them off the road and put them in trash cans and they leave them out there to be destroyed.
Yeah, and you get money too. So.
They have roundups now.
Yeah.
They have a competition to see who can catch the biggest one. Sorry. Sorry, Matt. What was
Me,
it?
walking catfish.
Somebody had it as a fish breeder again in Florida, right?
Mm-hmm.
Freaking Florida, God. Yes?
They were supposed to be in Colorado, but they moved to Arizona.
And why were they in Colorado? They're a pet?
No, they were supposed to destroy some trees over there, but they just migrated. So.
We might come back to that one in a minute. Anybody else have an exotic thing that escaped? Yes? Number 2. There are some species that just move around by accident. Nobody wanted them, but they just travel in cargo, or they travel in water on a ship. A lot of times a boat will soak up ocean water to be more stable, and then when they dump that out, they've moved stuff around the world. Anybody have an accidental or a tag-along? Colin has the world's most famous tag-along. It's called a quagga or a zebra mussel. It's this little tiny shell where the larva will anchor onto stuff, and they literally are the size of like a grain of sand.
Yeah, that's big as your fingernail.
The adults are?
Oh
Yeah, the larvae, you don't even see them. They're just teeny, they're like almost invisible. And so they'll stick to the outside of your boat, they'll stick on the inside of your boat, and then you go someplace else and you run some water through the boat and they spread eggs for more, or larvae for more. Yeah.
Those were in the movie last week, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I forgot this, in the
That's
Oregon
what
movie?
the movie was about. Yeah.
Oh, alright. Fun fact, those little mussels are the world's most expensive invasive. That's actually the last chunk of your notes, so we might as well do this now. The world's most expensive invasive is the zebra mussel. Because they mess up plumbing that was only designed to be permanent. Like dams, locks, the drains at harbors. Mussels are brutal. Can you imagine how expensive it would be to replace all the plumbing underneath Lake Kachuma? But the mussels will just clog it the way that cholesterol gives you buildup inside of your arteries.
Are they in Lake
Probably.
Because I was reading the Slow Water District had a big article on it, so they're up there.
Interesting, yeah. I know that most California reservoirs require inspections and a stamp for your boat. But I don't know if they've been found in Kachuma yet. Sooner or later, all of our infrastructure will have zebra and quagga mussels. It's just a matter of time. And that's really scary because a lot of these dams were not built to be serviced. You know, it's supposed to be just clean water. Number 3. There are biological controls. Species that we release to control other species, like the cane toad. I think Apollo had one where like the beetle was supposed to, kill a tree?
So there was this kind of tree that was growing really fast in Colorado, and so they were brought in to eat that tree, and then they were just spreading all over Arizona.
I have to warn you about something. Apollo's example is a perfect one. Biological controls are really, really sketchy. When you bring one species to control another one, by moving it, you've kind of given it a fresh menu. It's like, oh, here, welcome to a new restaurant. Try this menu.
All you can eat buffet.
Right,
Like both have burgers, but one has spaghetti and one has pizza.
I guess. Did anybody else have a biological control? A species that was introduced to control other species? Number 4, There are some species that humans released on purpose because they just like other things. Like the European starling.
Oh.
Some species were released because we just want to see them around. It's really common in the tropics to release fish that are beautiful so that you can get more people to go diving there. Of course, a lot of the fish that are easy to move through the tropics are super invasive and kind of devastating. So many parts of Southeast Asia where people are trying to grow an ecotourism economy will start moving fish around because, you know, people will pay to come see your fish. And then we end up wrecking the reefs that we're trying to improve. Does anybody else have an an intentional release?
There's this one squirrel, the gray squirrel they released in the UK.
Really?
The red squirrel.
Oh yeah.
Huh. And do you know why it was released? What the hope was?
Yeah, with the pool. They're cute.
Ew.
Number 5, and this is an interesting new situation. Climate change is shifting niches. That's kind of key lingo. I hope you weren't talking to Zoe so that you would have caught that. But climate change shifts niches. It means the way that you used to make a living over there now works over here. And so climate change is kind of creating an opportunity for species to move on their own. Like that insect couldn't live here, but now that it's warmer, it can. Ducks couldn't overwinter here, but now that it's warmer, they can. And so in an interesting way, by changing the climate, we've made all sorts of invasive species, and we never have to touch them. If I make the whole planet 2 degrees hotter, I can just stand back, and all the ducks will go over here, and all the insects will go over there. And so climate change is like an indirect invasion. There are a couple of famous examples, a few invasive species that you really need to know. One of them, the Norway rat, has the biggest invasion map, meaning it went from a really small native map to basically everywhere on the planet. There's rats at the South Pole part of the year. There's rats on ships in the ocean. There's rats on almost every island on Earth. There's rats on every continent. There's rats on places that are ecological islands isolated from other landscapes. There's almost no place that you cannot find a rat. And they originally had a pretty small range. Number 2. The one which causes the most human death is the zebra mosquito. Of all the invasives, if you want to save a human's life, you should probably get rid of the mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are just obnoxious, but they do carry disease, and they carry some really severe diseases.
Is that the one that carries malaria?
It is. And dengue fever and West Nile virus. Number whatever's next. The most extinctions were caused by a little snake called the brown tree snake. It's not that big of a deal, but it's a quirk of ecology. So this is a great ecology lesson. You have enough time to understand it. Islands have a bunch of native species that are only found on those islands. It's called island endemism because they evolve independently, like the Galapagos finches. You have unique species on islands. That's one fact. It's called island endemism, that islands all have unique species. And second of all, there's a whole bunch of islands that don't have snakes, because snakes don't travel naturally very well at all. Birds can get blown hundreds of miles and land on a new island, but snakes? So imagine being a tropical snake that is carried by humans onto a variety of tropical islands.
What else, like a pet?
They're tag-alongs in landscaping. They love potted plants.
Oh, so they're like real small.
So like you go to your new military base and you take your little house plant and there's a little tiny snake that looks like a fat worm coiled up in the dirt and you never even notice. And when it gets to the island, it falls from your plant and it cruises into the bushes, and all the birds are not afraid of snakes because they evolved on an environment without snakes. So the brown tree snake has caused hundreds and it's pushing 1,000 extinctions on its own. A single invasive species of snake falls on all these tropical islands where all the birds are unique to that island and they don't have a fear of snakes because they evolved without snakes around. So they'll walk over to the branch and the branch eats them.
Wait, so like they're small, do they grow bigger?
Yeah, brown tree snakes, I think they hit a yard. They're like that. They're not huge. But they're devastating. They're the most extinctions caused by that. These are all species that are pretty rare, like the birds are only on this one island, so it's easy to make them go extinct. As we said, the most expensive is the zebra or the quagga mussel. The deadliest, the invasive species that eats the most biomass. Anybody want to guess that one? You.
I don't know. Cats?
That's right. House cats. Every single house cat, once it gets outside, will eat hundreds of birds and lizards per year.
So we should kill them.
I kind of think so, yeah.
I agree.
Like, ecologically, you saw how in cane toads, some Australians will run over cane toads on the freeways. I have heard people express that belief about cats.
Oh.
I know, if you're a cat lover, it sounds harsh and it's not the cat's fault, but man, cats are devastating ecologically. Like, bird watchers hate your outside cat. The starling is famous because it was released on purpose, and it's wiped out bird species all over the Americas. It's a nest parasite. It sneaks its babies into the nest of another species. Talk about an evolutionary novelty. Native birds will just feed whatever's in the nest. What else would be there? And I've got one that I have to warn you is not scientifically settled. But there is an argument that wild horses, Mustangs, where they are invasive, might actually be beneficial. Because North America used to have big herbivores during the Pleistocene. North America had giant sloths, and it had many antelope and elk and deer and buffalo. And in many parts of the Americas, we've lost those big mammals. So the horses kind of fill an ecological function that's been missing. Apparently, wild horses in some landscapes can prevent wildfires. In some landscapes, they make deer more healthy, and I don't understand how that is. In other landscapes, they accelerate erosion. In other landscapes, they eat rare plants. In other landscapes, they spread disease. But there's some evidence that in some places, wild horses are actually ecologically beneficial. It's kind of a weird argument in ecology, where like, there is a rational argument to be made for actually releasing horses in some places. Moving wild horses to places where they're not native. I find this to be kind of an interesting and hot thing. Okay. Can you press stop streaming? It's the top button right there. Or, okay. We've got like